The sun burned softly over Enkakoma as little Zuena sat on the old wooden porch, her feet coated in red dust, her eyes full of dreams too big for her small world. She wanted to go to school, to wear shoes, to eat until her stomach stopped aching. But in her home, dreams were a luxury. Hunger spoke louder than hope. When the merchant arrived with a sack of maize balanced on his shoulder, her father's face changed. His eyes didn't see his daughter anymore, only the food that could quiet the cries in their hut. That evening, as the orange sky faded into night, Zuena was lifted into the back of a truck. She kicked, screamed, begged, but the sound of the engine drowned her voice. Her mother ran behind, crying her name until her breath broke. In the city, Zuena learned how cruel the world could be. Some people offered food, others offered pain disguised as kindness. But even as her heart cracked, she kept one promise deep inside her. One day she would return. She would come back not as the poor girl who was sold, but as the woman no one could ever sell again. In the heart of Lusaka, behind tall iron gates and shining glass windows, Zuena lived like a shadow. Every morning before sunrise, she scrubbed the marble floors of Madame Farah's mansion until they gleamed brighter than the sun outside. Her small hands cracked from soap and water, her nails chipped, her skin dry and sore. Madame Farah never called her by name. She called her the Maize girl, a cruel reminder of the price her father had accepted. "Kneel when you speak," Madame Farah would say, even when Zuena hadn't spoken at all. Every mistake, real or imagined, earned her a slap or a harsh word. The mansion was beautiful, but to Zuena it was a golden cage. She watched the family's children play with toys she could never touch, eat food she could only smell. At night, when the house grew quiet, she sat alone in the corner of the kitchen, sweeping crumbs into her palm and eating them quickly before anyone saw. The loneliness was heavier than the buckets she carried, but one evening, while cleaning the study, she found something that changed everything: a torn, dirty book left by one of the children. She opened it carefully, afraid it might fall apart. The pages smelled of dust and ink. The words were strange and hard, but she whispered them aloud, tracing each letter with her finger. Slowly, painfully, she taught herself to read. Each night, after everyone slept, she would steal a few minutes under the weak kitchen light, turning pages with trembling hands. The stories in those books carried her far from the mansion. They showed her places where girls weren't sold, where voices mattered, where dreams could live. For the first time since she left her village, she felt hope breathing again inside her chest. But secrets never stayed hidden in Madame Farah's house. One night, as Zuena read quietly, a shadow fell across the floor. It was Tund, Madame Farah's eldest son. He was tall, proud, and cruel like his mother. "What are you doing?" he sneered. "You." Reading, he grabbed the book from her hands and flipped through it. His smirk faded as he looked at her. There was something in her eyes he didn't expect, fire, quiet but fierce. It wasn't fear, it was strength. For a moment he didn't know what to say. He just stared. Then he tossed the book back and left without a word. That night, Zuena pressed the book against her heart. For the first time, she felt powerful, even in chains. Knowledge became her armor. It was her secret weapon against the world that had tried to silence her. She promised herself that one day she would not just clean the floors of mansions. She would walk through doors of her own, head high, hands unbroken and free. Years passed, and the little girl who had once been sold for a sack of maize was no longer little. Zuena had grown into a quiet, determined young woman. The pain of her past didn't fade. It became her fuel. Every scar, every sleepless night in Madame Farah's house had taught her how to survive. When she finally left the mansion, she carried nothing with her except her strength, her secret love for reading, and a fierce promise to never be owned again. Life in the city was hard, but Zuena knew hardship well. She worked wherever she could, washing clothes, cleaning shops, selling vegetables by the roadside. Every coin mattered. When she was paid, she didn't spend it on food or clothes. She saved, she hid her small earnings under the loose floorboards of the tiny room she rented. Sometimes she went to bed hungry, her stomach aching, but her heart was strong. "One day," she whispered to herself, "I'll be more than this." Her chance came one afternoon at the market. A group of people from an NGO had come to help with a community project. They were looking for someone who could speak both Bemba and English. Zuena, who had spent years secretly teaching herself to read and speak, raised her hand shyly. The man in charge tested her, and when she translated a few sentences perfectly, his face lit up. "You're hired," he said. Those two words changed her life. Working with the NGO opened doors she never knew existed. She helped translate letters, guide visitors, and organize meetings. People began to see her not as the Maize girl, but as a woman of value. Her confidence grew. The more she learned, the hungrier she became for knowledge. Soon, one of her supervisors helped her apply for a scholarship. When the acceptance letter arrived, Zuina cried for the first time in years, tears not of pain, but of hope. She studied hard, sometimes staying up all night to read. Education became her freedom. She earned certificates, then more opportunities came, training programs, travel, and even a short trip abroad. Each new experience widened her world. Yet through it all, one thought stayed with her. Her mother, she wrote letters whenever she could, telling her how much she missed her, how she was working to build a better life. She never got a reply, but she never stopped writing. Sometimes at night, she would close her eyes and remember the mango trees of Enkakoma, the smell of dust after rain, the laughter of children playing barefoot. She didn't know that her father had sold even that land, the last piece of her childhood. But Zuina didn't need that soil anymore to grow. She had planted her own seeds of courage, learning, and change, and they were finally beginning to bloom. The afternoon sun baked the dry earth of Enkakoma when a shiny black car rolled into the village, its engine purring like something from another world. Children ran behind it, shouting, while elders stopped mid-conversation to stare. Dust rose in clouds, swirling around the car as it stopped near the same cracked porch where a little barefoot girl once sat dreaming. The door opened slowly, and a woman stepped out. She was tall, graceful, dressed in white linen that shimmered in the sunlight. Her skin glowed, her hair was neatly tied, and when she looked around, her eyes were calm but sharp, eyes that had seen too much to ever forget. "Who is she?" the villagers whispered. "A government woman, a visitor." No one recognized her at first, but then someone noticed the way she looked at the mango trees, the broken hut, the dusty road that led out of the village. That gaze held memories, old, painful ones. "Could it be?" someone murmured, but no one dared to say her name aloud. Near the hut, an old man sat on a stool, thin and frail, his eyes sunken from years of regret. It was her father. The man who once sold her for a sack of maize now lived surrounded by debt and shame. His clothes hung loosely on his bony frame, and his hands trembled as he tried to shield his eyes from the bright sunlight. When he saw the car, curiosity flickered across his face, but when his gaze met hers, the world seemed to stop. He froze. Those eyes, he knew them. "Zuina," he whispered, his voice trembling like dry leaves in the wind. Zuina stood still. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavy, as if the whole village was holding its breath. She looked at her father, not with anger, but with the quiet strength of someone who had already made peace with her pain. She took a deep breath, then turned toward the village chief who had come forward, confused but respectful. From her bag, she pulled out a brown envelope and handed it to him. "These are the new land papers," she said simply. The chief opened the documents, his eyes widening as he read aloud, "Owner Zuina Tembo." A gasp rippled through the crowd. People turned to look at her father. His mouth opened, but no words came. He stumbled forward, his knees hitting the dirt. Tears filled his eyes as he looked up at her. The same ground that once cut her feet now cradled his sorrow. "My child," he whispered, voice breaking. "Forgive me." Zuina didn't move. She watched him with quiet sadness. There were no words left to say. She had come back not as the hungry little girl he sold, but as the woman who now owned the very land he had given away. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows as the villagers stood in stunned silence. Zuina turned toward the horizon, her face calm, her heart finally home. The crowd around them stayed quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Zuina stood tall before the old man who had once been her father, her white dress fluttering softly against the dry wind. His frail hands trembled as he tried to steady himself on his knees, his face streaked with tears and dust. His voice cracked as he looked up at her, unable to meet her eyes for long. "Zuina, my child," he whispered. "I was hungry, desperate, I had nothing left." The words came out broken, each one soaked in guilt. "I never meant to hurt you, I didn't know what else to do." Zuina's heart ached, but her face stayed calm. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, what she would say, how she would feel. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like truth. She looked down at him, her voice quiet but steady. "You sold me for a bag of maize," she said softly. The words cut through the silence like a knife. "And now I bought you for your land." There was no anger in her tone, no bitterness, only sadness, the kind that runs deep and never really leaves. The villagers watched, wide-eyed, whispering among themselves. Some covered their mouths, others simply stared. No one dared to speak. For years they had pitied her father, thinking his daughter was lost forever. Now she stood before them, strong, educated, and unbroken. while he knelt in the dust of his own choices. Zewina slowly reached into the back of her car and lifted out a heavy sack. The same kind of sack that had once carried her fate. She placed it gently at her father's feet. "This time," she said quietly, her voice shaking, "I'm feeding you." The crowd fell silent again. The bag was full, clean maize, golden and shining in the afternoon light. Her father stared at it as if it were fire. His lips trembled and more tears fell, but this time they were not from hunger. They were from shame. He touched the sack gently, his fingers tracing its rough surface as his shoulders began to shake. "You came back," he whispered. "After everything I did, you came back." Zewina took a step closer and knelt beside him, her hands steady. "I came back," she said softly, "because I needed to end what you started, not with hate, but with peace." She reached out, brushing the dust from his shoulder, just as her mother once brushed the dust from hers when she was a child. Her eyes filled, but she held her tears. The villagers looked on, moved and silent. In that moment, under the blazing Enkakoma sun, forgiveness stood taller than pain. Zewina had turned her suffering into grace. Her father wept openly, not as a man begging for food, but as one finally facing the weight of his sin. And for the first time, the earth felt lighter. The rains came early that year, and for the first time in a long time, the land of Enkakoma began to breathe again. The soil, once dry and cracked, softened under Zewina's hands. Every morning she walked through the fields, her white dress now replaced with a simple chitonge, her feet bare against the earth she had reclaimed. She planted maize, cassava, groundnuts, seeds of hope that carried her name in every root. Where her father had once sold away their land, she now rebuilt it, piece by piece, turning pain into something living again. The villagers watched her in awe. Some helped her clear the fields, others brought water, others just stood at the edge of the land, whispering blessings. Zewina didn't just grow food, she grew a new beginning. With the help of her savings and the people who believed in her story, she built small homes for widows, for the poor, for those who had lost everything. Then came her biggest dream, a school for the girls of Enkakoma. "No girl here will ever be sold again," she said when the first classroom opened. The children clapped, their laughter rising higher than the birds above the mango trees. Word of her work spread across nearby villages. People came to see the woman they called the girl who returned. They brought gifts of maize, goats, and stories. Some asked her how she could still live with her father after everything he had done. She would only smile gently and say, "Because forgiveness is richer than revenge." Her words carried a calm that silenced everyone around her. They could see it in her eyes. She had healed in a way that no anger could ever give her. The day of the first harvest was a celebration like no other. The air was filled with the smell of roasted maize and the sound of drums. Children danced barefoot in the dust, women sang songs of gratitude, and the old men clapped in rhythm. Zewina moved among them, smiling, handing out roasted corn to everyone. The fields that had once been her sorrow were now alive with laughter and joy. Under the old baobab tree, her father sat in the shade, wrapped in a thin blanket. He was too weak to join the dancing, but his eyes followed the movement of the children. The same ground where his sins had once grown now overflowed with life. Zewina walked to him and knelt quietly beside him, holding a cob of roasted maize. She broke it gently, feeding him one golden kernel at a time. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The world around them buzzed with joy, but between them was only peace. Finally, he looked at her, his voice soft and trembling. "You became everything I wasn't," he whispered. Zewina smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "No, Papa," she said. "I just became what you once hoped I could be." And as the sun set behind the hills, the fields of Enkakoma glowed gold, alive with forgiveness, love, and new beginnings. The story of Zewina Tembo traveled faster than the wind that swept across the fields of Enkakoma. What began as whispers in one small village grew into a story told on radios, printed in newspapers, and shared on screens far beyond Zambia. People called her the girl of maize. They said she turned her pain into purpose, her scars into seeds. Journalists came to see the woman who had been sold for food but returned to feed others. When they asked how she found the strength to forgive, she only smiled and said, "Because hate never grows anything." Zewina started receiving invitations to speak at schools, women's forums, and conferences. The first time she stood before a crowd, her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "A girl's worth," she said, "is not counted in bags or coins. It's measured by what she dares to become." The room went silent before the applause began. People wept, inspired by her courage. They saw in her story a mirror of their own struggles, the hunger, the loss, the dreams that refused to die. Soon, organizations began working with her to build more schools in rural areas. She helped start programs that taught young girls to read, to dream, and to believe in their own power. She also opened training centers for women, teaching them how to farm, run small businesses, and stand tall in a world that had tried to keep them on their knees. Every time she spoke, she reminded them, "You are not what you were sold for. You are what you choose to rise for." Back in Enkakoma, the land that once carried her pain had become a place of hope. Each season, the maize grew taller, brighter, stronger. Her father's old field was now known as the Field of Second Chances. It became a gathering place for villagers, students, and visitors who wanted to see where the story began. On the 10th anniversary of her return, Zuwina decided to honor the journey. She used her savings to build a monument in the center of the maize field. When it was unveiled, the entire village came together: children, elders, mothers, and even people from distant towns. The statue stood tall and proud, a young girl made of bronze, holding a cob of maize in one hand and a book in the other. Her face looked upward, full of hope. At the base of the statue, carved into stone, were the words that would be remembered for generations. They sold her for food. She came back feeding nations. When Zuwina saw those words, she felt tears run down her face, not of sadness but of peace. She looked up at the statue and whispered, "You are every girl who was told she was worth nothing." Around her, the wind blew gently through the maize, carrying her story into the distance, one that would keep growing like the seeds she had once planted with her own hands. The day her father died, the sky over Enkakoma was calm and golden, as if the sun itself wanted to say goodbye. Zuwina stood beneath the old baobab tree where he used to sit, the same spot where she had once fed him roasted maize with her own hands. Now that tree would be his final resting place. She buried him quietly without a crowd or ceremony, just her and the wind. She didn't cry. The tears had come years ago, and the pain had already taught her everything it needed to. When the burial was done, she walked to the middle of the field, the same field that had once been her prison, her burden, and her triumph. The air smelled of ripe maize and earth after rain. Behind her, the villagers began to sing softly, their voices rising like a prayer. The sound wrapped around her, gentle and healing. Zuwina looked up at the wide sky, the colors of sunset painting her face in gold and red. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "I am no longer the girl who was sold," she whispered to the wind. "I am the woman who owns the story." For a moment, the breeze seemed to answer her, carrying her words across the land she had rebuilt. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the field glowed with the light of harvest. A final promise kept, a circle completed, and a heart finally at peace.